What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, and on this Monday edition of the podcast, I've got your Week 2 PLL recap from this past weekend down in Atlanta. On this episode, we'll get to a few things. First, like I said, we're going to recap Week 2 in the PLL. Then in segment 2, I'm going to get to a new segment here on the podcast called the Two-Man Game, so we're going to get to that a little bit later. I'll explain more about that when we get to it. And then finally, we're going to wrap up the show the same as we did in last Monday's episode. We'll get your thoughts in the mix, plus I'll give you my updated Week 2 PLL power rankings. But to jump right into these games from this past weekend down in Atlanta, on Friday, the Water Dogs defeat the Chaos 14-12 in what ended up actually being a very exciting finish there on Friday night. The Chaos hit 3 of the 5 two-pointers in that game, 2 by Jake Fricaro alone. Adler, though, another sub 50% game, going 11 of 24 against Jake Withers at the stripe, and Jack Rowlett had a solid game defensively with 2 caused turnovers and 6 ground balls in that game. Blaze, in the first 2 games, though, 27 goals against and just 33 saves, so not really necessarily up to where we've seen him in past years. But again, I've said it before in a couple episodes last week, he's really the only guy right now that's at least trying to play at a high level, really trying to produce. And like I said, he can't do it on his own. He needs help. And we'll get to some of your thoughts on that towards the end of the show, as I mentioned. But the Water Dogs offense really came alive here this weekend. They had 2 games this weekend. I said on Thursday's episode, these were going to be 2 big games for them, especially offensively, with the loss of Michael Sowers, to see how guys like Schlosser, McCardle, Brown, even guys like Reeves and Kelly, how they would come out this weekend after having basically no impact offensively a week ago. And they did, like I said, they came alive. They woke up this weekend because against the Chaos, Schlosser, Brown, and Kelly combined for 11 points with 6 one-pointers, 2 two-point goals, and 1 assist on the night. McCardle didn't play in that game on Friday, but appeared in the game on Sunday and had a pretty solid game there. But Zach Courier in the midfield had 1 goals, 2 caused turnovers, and 7 ground balls. So a pretty interesting stat line for him, but a solid game overall. He also had an interesting stat line again on Sunday, but we'll get to that game here in a few minutes. Withers, again, went 56% at the stripe against Adler, and Ward played better, I think, in the cage for the Water Dogs, only giving up 9 goals, and half the Chaos's points came off those 2-pointers that they hit. They had 3 of the 5 in that game. So I thought he really started to play a lot better. Dylan Ward did here this weekend. I was critical of the way he played in week 1, but I think he's now starting to get his feet under him as a starting goalie here in the PLL after backing up Blaze Reardon for the last 2 years. On Saturday, we had a couple games, starting out with the Whipsnakes dropping the Cannons in overtime 15-14. That another very exciting game, went down to the wire in the 4th quarter. The Cannons able to push it to overtime, but the Whipsnakes were able to prevail in a game that could have really gone either way. The Whipsnakes defense didn't play, I think, up to their usual high level, giving up the 9 goals combined to Lyle Drenner and Paul Rabel. Paul Rabel making the SportsCenter top 10 plays with one of his, I believe it was 2 goals in that game. And one thing that was definitely working for the Whipsnakes was the ability of Joe Nardella to win faceoffs and then move it to Zed Williams on the wing, and then Williams getting that quick score off the draw. They did that 2, 3, 4 times against the Cannons on Saturday afternoon. So it was just interesting to see how they were basically able to destroy that adjacent slide by the Cannons on that play, because a guy like Brody Merrill had no chance to bump out to Zed Williams from the crease. So interesting to see how the Cannons played that situation, but also interesting to see that time and time again the Whipsnakes were able to take advantage of that look as well. But it was another balanced game offensively for the Whipsnakes, with 6 players scoring a goal for them. The Cannons, though, did look like they can hang with anyone in this league this year, because I said on Thursday's episode, even if they were to lose that game, if they played it close, if they played it tough, and were able to go toe-to-toe with the Whipsnakes, there's no reason they can't be a top 4 team in the PLL this year. The Cannons could be. And I still think that that's true because, again, they played it close. It was 8-4 at the half. in favor of the Whipsnakes, and the Cannons took that game to overtime against one of the best lacrosse teams in the world. I think defensively, they're led by one of the best to ever play the position, and I mentioned that last week, in a guy like Brody Merrill. And they also have the complement of young guys in Jack Keelty, Reese Eddy, guys like that around him defensively. And offensively, you have one of the best players in the world in Lyle Thompson, and anytime you can have that on your offense, you've got something good going for you. But Paul Rabel is successful this year because he doesn't have to be the guy, and this is something that we'll get to later on in the third segment, but he can be the fourth option in that offense and make the most of his opportunities while opposing defenses are keying on guys like Lyle or Andrew Q or even Steven Rafis now, who has 6 points in 3 games for the Cannons. But Nick Morocco, also a solid goalie for them so far this year, 11.3 scores against through 3 games. He's also averaging 16 saves a game, good for 60% overall. And I think in this league, that kind of play will win you more games than not. I know they're 1-2 right now, but they were a goal away from being 2-1 and beating the best team in the world. So really, I don't pay attention as much to that record right now because of the way that they played on Saturday and the competitive nature that they've brought to these first 3 games. Then on Saturday, the second game of the day was the Atlas stunning the Redwoods 12-9, the final there. Defensively, the Atlas, I think, looked a lot better from what we saw in week 1. I know I laid into the defense in last week's episode on Monday, but the defensive personnel were responsible for 9 caused turnovers and 14 ground balls for the Atlas in that game. The matchup that we were all waiting for, though, and that we could not wait to watch, was at the stripe between Trevor Baptiste and T.D. Erlin. And that matchup was actually won by T.D. Erlin, but Kincannon was back to his old tricks, making 17 saves and good for 65% on the game. So even though they didn't win the matchup at the stripe, they made the most of their opportunities when they presented themselves, because the offense really looked confident this week, having 5 goal scorers in the game, led by Jake Carraway and Eric Law with 3 each. Danny Logan even got his first pro goal this weekend too. So my question for the Atlas, though, moving forward, and I think I mentioned this in one of the episodes a week ago, is who is their late shot clock playmaker? Is it Eric Law? I mean, he's done it before in 2019. He could be that guy, and I think he has every ability to be that guy. But I think Carraway showed that he can make things happen too late in the shot clock, and just in general can make plays when plays need to be made. So it could be him moving forward. But the Redwoods, I don't think, look like the Redwoods they did in week 1 when they went 2-0 a week ago on week number 1. But maybe in some ways they did look the same, and the Atlas were just able to take advantage of their mistakes. We talked about some of the miscues that this Redwoods offense had in week 1, but they were still able to come out on top in both their matchups. So maybe the Atlas were just able to better take advantage of some of those miscues, because Rob Pennell, while leading the charge offensively with 4 points on Saturday, also turned it over 4 times in that game. Matt Kavanaugh as well tallied just 1 point, but he also had 3 turnovers. So between the two of them, that's 7 turnovers. And Sergio Perkovic and Ryan Lee combined for 0 for 5 shooting and 0 points in that loss. Defensively, I think the Atlas didn't look intimidated by this Redwoods offense, because they have shooters that can come from any direction. So they really, I think, went at their shooters and went at their playmakers and forced them to make mistakes. And like I said, when they made those mistakes, they were able to capitalize on it at the other end of the field. And like I said before, T.D. Erlin won that matchup against Trevor Baptiste, but in the end of the day, it was the Atlas that came out and played, in my mind, they played out of their minds, and the Woods came back down to earth a little bit from week 1, where some of those mistakes, like I said, didn't really come back to haunt them as much. But just an overall fantastic game by the Atlas. I was thrilled with the way that they played. Not perfect, I'll say that. It wasn't perfect by any means, but considering what we saw a week ago, it was so much more improved than I think anybody could have imagined from this team that fast. And now they have a week off to sort of go back and look at some film and fix some of those things that, like I said, they didn't play perfectly. There is still things they can work on, things that they can address, and they can now do that going into this bye week because they do have a big matchup coming on Friday night in week 3 in Baltimore. I'll be there in Baltimore for that weekend of games, but they have the Whip Snakes on Friday night, and then they play the Cannons on Sunday afternoon. So a big weekend for them coming up here in week 3. Then Sunday, we got a couple games to get to real fast. The Water Dogs win their second game of the weekend, 14-9 over the Chrome. The Water Dogs offense, like I said in their previous game against the Chaos, they came alive this weekend after nothing doing in week 1. Losing Sowers to the injury didn't help their cause either, but it didn't seem to matter this weekend. They found those guys that can make plays. They can put the ball in the back of the net. Versus Chaos, Schlosser, Brown, and Ben Reeves combined for 10 goals on 17 shots. McCardle and Krause and Rylan Reese had the other goals. But Zach Currier, another interesting stat line, like I said, for him, 2 assists, 2 caused turnovers, and 7 ground balls. Jake Withers battled all afternoon with Connor Farrell at the stripe, and Dylan Ward had another solid game in the cage, which helped lead them to victory. And like I said, I think what you saw in week 1 was him just trying to knock off a little bit of rust from backing up Blaze Reardon the last 2 years. Now I think he's starting to get the flow of things. He's starting to play at a higher level like I think we expected from him coming into the year. But I think for the Chrome, much like the Chaos, might be in trouble even this early on in the season because they turned the ball over a lot in this game, 24 times to be exact, compared to just 15 shots on goal for the Chrome offense. And I get losing Jordan Wolf hurts, but he wasn't your whole offense at the same time. The Chrome had 5 goal scorers on Sunday, one of which was a 2-bomb by Mike Manley in transition. And Gutterding, again, just had 1 goal on 3 shots. He also accounted for 3 turnovers. And Colin Heacock also had 1 goal on just 3 shots as well. So they do need to start getting some more production out of guys like Gutterding, out of Heacock, because right now they're kind of putting it on the rookies to be their playmakers, to be their goal scorers. Guys like Tarafanko, Morrill. On Sunday they had Rogers in there as well on offense. So getting guys like Gutterding and Heacock going, I think, will help this offense out tremendously, especially with the absence of Jordan Wolf. But finally on Sunday, the 5th and final game of the weekend, the Archers rally past the Chaos 12-8, the final there. The Archers offense looks really fun and creative to watch go to work on the field. They also outscored the Chaos 5-1 in the second half of that game. Chris Bates, I think, made an interesting move starting Drew Adams over Gittleman, who then came in the second half and absolutely killed it, making 88% of his save opportunities and giving up just the 1 goal there in that second half. And Stephen Kelly was fantastic on faceoffs versus Kyle Gallagher, 71% with 10 ground balls and a goal to his credit as well. So a really solid stat line out of Stephen Kelly on Sunday afternoon. But Eamon and Manny combined for 6 goals and 4 assists, all 4 of the helpers coming from Grant Ament there, but 6 goals and 4 assists is a really good for 2/3 of your attack line. And then the Chaos just look very sloppy to start the year, now 0-3 on the year, but they have 57 turnovers, which is 19 turnovers a game, and just 47 shots on goal over 3 games. And what's worse is that they're facing off at 36% through their 3 games. So obviously not where Andy Towers in this group want to be. Still have a handful of games left to go this season. I believe they have 6 more for the regular season, so plenty of time to turn things around, but just not the start that we expected from this Chaos squad. But when we come back, we'll get into that new segment that I teased at the top of the show called the 2-man game, where we're going to discuss the 2 winners and 2 losers from this weekend in Atlanta. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. So I teased before the break that we're going to get into this new segment called the two-man game, where we pick the two winners and two losers from this past weekend. We'll do this each and every Monday on the podcast, talking about that previous weekend that just wrapped up in the PLL. So my winners for week 2 in Atlanta are Paul Rabel and the Atlas. So I think that this is quickly becoming Rabel's best year in the PLL by far when you look statistically in the production that he's able to bring to this Cannons offense. I mean, we're only through week 2 and he has 9 points in 3 games. In 2020, he had 5 points in 5 games during the championship series. So the Cannons have 6 more games left, and if Rabel can keep up this pace of production, he'll pass his 2019 point total of 23. Pretty easily, by the way, too, by about 5 or 6 points if he's able to keep up this level of production. Now, that might be a little asking too much of him given some of the other guys that they have in this offense, but from what I've seen from him through these first 3 games, there's no reason that he can't keep doing exactly what he's been doing, especially, like I said, when opposing defenses have to worry about matching up with Q and Lyle Thompson and Drenner and Rafis and all these other guys. There's no reason that Rabel, sort of being that 4th or 5th guy in that offense, can't continue putting up the kind of numbers that he's been. And I don't think it's a matter of Rabel necessarily finding that fountain of youth that people sometimes talk about with athletes when they get towards the final few years of their career. I think it's more likely that he's just being asked to play a complementary role to those guys like Lyle and Q and Drenner and Rafis, etc., because he no longer has to be the guy in an offense where he's one of your top maybe 3 scorers on your team. He can settle for just being, like I said, that 4th or 5th guy, although he is currently second on the team to Lyle Thompson, with Andrew Q and Ryan Drenner right behind him with 8 and 7 points respectively. But Rabel is showing that with the right team around him, he can still be successful as a productive offensive player. And I just don't think that the Atlas was a good fit for him, especially not in 2020 with some of the things that Ben Rubior was trying to implement with that team. And then my second winner from the weekend was the Atlas because of how poorly they played in week 1. And I talked about that at length last week. We all know that their performance last week was completely lackluster. And what I think many other people wanted going into this matchup with the Redwoods was just to see some level of improvement. They didn't have to win the game. It didn't have to be a 1 or 2 goal game, but just get it to where you don't feel bad about it afterwards, where you can watch it and say, yeah, you know what? You definitely saw there was an improvement in this 1 or 2 aspects from last week. They definitely worked on this. They're getting better. You're seeing the players starting to buy into the system and what they're trying to do. It wasn't perfect again, but it's better. But they went out there and we saw that fight, a little more cohesion at both ends of the field, offensively and defensively. And overall, we saw that buy-in, guys giving it their all. They were making the plays when the plays were there to be made. And I went into that game, again, not expecting them to win, but hoping that they would at least compete. And they ended up playing probably their best game since defeating the Chaos back in late 2019. And you might ask about, what about beating the Water Dogs in 2020? That was their lone win of the championship series, was that game against the Water Dogs. And the Atlas, in my mind, played poorly in that game for about 3 quarters and had to race from behind in that 4th quarter of that game. I believe they were down about 4 going into that final quarter. So you didn't necessarily walk away from that game feeling the way that I did Saturday, feeling like they went out there, they played better than the Redwoods. They executed at both ends of the field. Again, not perfect, but they executed enough to where they did look like the better team, at least on that given day, whereas you didn't get that same feeling from that game against the Water Dogs a year ago. So again, like I said, that was probably the best game they've played and probably the best I felt about this Atlas team since they beat the Chaos back in 2019. So then after the game, they showed a clip on social media of the players in the locker room. They were all excited about the win, obviously, and they were hyping each other up. But one thing that stood out to me was what John Crawley said after that game in the locker room, he mentioned this mentality of 7%. And what that meant was that going into that game, 7% of the people on the PLL website, when you voted on the pick'em pools, 7% of people had them winning that game. So he was talking about having that same mentality the rest of the way here in 2021, is having that mentality that only 7% of people picked them to win that game, and they did it. So why can't they do that again moving forward? I'm sure, looking at that game against the Whipsnakes in 2 weeks, that's probably going to be the same situation. Not that many people are probably going to have them winning that game. So I'm sure he and some of those other Atlas players will go into that game with that 7% mentality of why not us? Why can't we do it again? We did it against the Redwoods. Why can't we do it again? But my losers for this week, and real quick before we get to that too, is the Cannons also, I think, showed the blueprint for these other teams in the league for how to beat the Whipsnakes. Even though they didn't actually beat them, they showed the blueprint of how it can be done. So that'll be something interesting to watch for moving forward the rest of the year, is if some of these teams adopt some of the things that the Cannons might have done to try and slow down this Whipsnakes team. But my losers, real quick, as we wrap up this segment, are the Chaos and the Chrome, because for both of these teams, it's pretty simple. You have to do better at taking care of the ball. The Chaos, as I mentioned earlier, averaged 19 turnovers a game while having 10 less shots on goal overall through their first 3 games. That's not a good statistic that you want to have right now at 0-3, but it's a big reason why you are where you are in the standings at 0-3. And I think for the Chrome, in an offense that features Gutterding, Colin Heacock, Jordan McIntosh, your leading scorer through 2 games is a rookie in Jackson Morrill, and Joel White has as many points as Justin Gutterding and Colin Heacock. I mentioned it before. Those 2 in specific have to start getting going. They have to be better. They have to start taking more command over this offense and making more plays, because you can't rely on your rookies within that offense to be the ones leading the charge. You have to be the ones taking control, making the plays, making those other rookies, I guess, look better in a way, and taking some of the pressure off them. Because again, Jordan Wolf was not your entire offense. There's no reason that this offense can't be productive even with his absence, because you saw it this weekend. The Water Dogs found ways to be productive without Michael Sowers. So the the Chrome need to find a way to get guys like Gutterding and Heacock going to take the pressure off some of those rookies from having to be the ones to be productive and put the ball in the back of the net. And for the Chaos, I mentioned it too with Adler and Gallagher in segment 1. They've struggled at the stripe, and even after picking up a guy like Adler, who was seen as one of the best face-off guys in the MLL a year ago, it just needs to be better. They need to do better at the face-off stripe, being able to get more possession for their offense. And then when their offense gets it, it's as simple as just not turning the ball over as much as what they've been, because Blaze Reardon cannot win you games by himself. And while we're at it, where's Jared Newman been? I mean, I know I may not have been paying attention as much during some of the Chaos games. I may have only been kind of listening in and out at times, but he almost seems like, for the most part, that he's disappeared so far this year, whereas in 2019 and 2020, it's like you always knew where he was on the field, and they were always quick to point him out. Guys like Brennan Burke and Ryan Boyle were so quick to point him out on the field. I don't hear his name being called as much this year, so it's almost like he's kind of just disappeared out there on defense. But when you watch the Chaos and the Chrome play right now, it isn't really a mystery why they currently sit 7th and 8th in the standings, because they have a turnover problem, they both do, and it needs to be fixed. And if you're the Chaos, you also need someone that can win you faceoffs at more than a 38% clip, which is what Adler's doing right now. So we've got one more segment to go. We talked about our winners and losers from this past weekend. I gave you my thoughts on all 5 games from down in Atlanta from week 2. So we got one more segment we got to hit on. I'll get to your thoughts in the mix as well, and I'll give you my updated power rankings through week 2 in the PLL. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Segment 3, we'll get to your thoughts, and I've got the power rankings coming up to round out the show. We got a couple comments I want to get to here. Big shout out to Jonathan Ellis and Michael Ramirez for hitting me up with a ton of responses on Twitter. At Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle. You can follow me there for all podcast and lacrosse related discussions. But to lead us off, Jonathan Ellis says, regarding Rabel and Pennell finding sort of success with their new teams, he says they don't have to be referring to being that guy like I talked about with Rabel in segment 2, being that guy within the offense. He says they don't have to be, they recognize they don't have to be, and they don't force themselves to be, which I would say plagued them a bunch in 2020. And he says, as a fan of both guys, I'm glad to see them thrive. Probably will make for some conflicting moments this season, though. And yeah, I would agree with that. They're both not trying to be that guy anymore. They understand this is a new team, new system. They have new personnel around them. They don't have to force things and try to make plays when they're not there. They can work with what they have around them because they do have ridiculously talented offensive personnel around them, whether you're talking about Rabel with the Cannons or Pennell now with the Redwoods. So they don't have to be, like I said with Rabel, he doesn't have to be a top 2 or 3 scorer on the Cannons. Same with Pennell. He doesn't have to be a top 2 or 3 scorer on the Redwoods. They can settle for being that sort of fourth guy in that offense. But I believe they're both top 2 currently through the first 2 weeks on their team in scoring. But again, they don't have to be, and they recognize they don't have to be, but also playing within those systems and playing with those other guys on offense that they have around them, it does open them up, to get more opportunities and to get more higher quality looks because they know that the defense are paying attention to Andrew Q and Lyle Thompson if you're Paul Rabel on the Cannons, or for Pennell, they're watching Perkovic or Henningberg or Miles Jones or Kavanaugh or whoever. But Michael Ramirez says, who do we, referring to the Atlas, go to for a late in the shot clock situation? Is it Law as our best option? And yeah, I'd say he probably is one. I mentioned it, I believe it was in segment 1, that Caraway's another guy that showed that he can be sort of that guy to force the issue at times on offense when a play needs to be made late in the possession, or even in a regular game situation. If a play needs to be made, he showed that he can be the guy that can just put his head down and go to the cage and make something happen, even if something isn't there. So I think Law probably is your best bet for that guy. I think Costabile at times can be that guy as well, although I think, again, they're not asking him to necessarily be that guy. But I think Caraway could be kind of a sneaky option there as well for your late shot clock guy, desperation, if you need something to happen, and that's kind of your go-to guy. But Jonathan Ellis, again, going back to him, responding to a tweet about the Atlas win compared to the Water Dogs game in 2020. I touched on this in segment 2. He says, I was just thinking about that Dogs game, and that was exactly my thought process too. No slight on the Woods at all, but while Atlas Dogs could have gone either way in my opinion, yesterday was the first time in a while where I could walk away from it saying the Atlas was the better team today. And yeah, I mentioned that in segment 2. Yes, it was nice to see them win against the Water Dogs last year in the championship series, but the way they did it was they played not great for 3 quarters, pulled it together for the 4th quarter, and was able to squeak it out by, I think, 1 or 2 goals maybe in that one. But the game on Saturday was the first time since the Chaos game in 2019 where you could walk away from it saying that the team that played better today, I wouldn't say the better team overall, because I still think that the Redwoods are a better team overall than the Atlas currently, but the better team on that given day walked away with the win. Michael Ramirez's winner from the weekend, he says, Atlas won, and I'm all smiles. Yeah, I had the Atlas as one of my winners in segment 2 as well. It's hard not to have picked them as one of your winners from this past weekend, given what we saw from them in week 1 to winning that game against, like I said, a superior at the moment Redwoods team on Saturday. Then to finally round it out, Jonathan Ellis says on his winners and losers from week 2, I've got to rewatch some of these games in full, but just on instinct, winners are Atlas, there is life there. Cannons looked game as hell against the Whips in spite of the loss, and his losers are the Chaos working Blaze, good as he is to the bone, and Chrome injury bugs are biting something fierce. And yeah, I would agree with all 4 of them. Like I said, I had the Atlas as one of my winners from this past weekend in Atlanta in segment 2. Cannons, I think, I went with Rabel in specific, but yeah, I think you could definitely put the Cannons as a winner this weekend, even though they lost that game to the Whipsnakes, because they're one of the few teams that's come as close as they did on Saturday to beating the Whipsnakes, and they might be the closest game that we see from the Whipsnakes all season. And then the losers, yeah, the Chaos and the Chrome. He does mention the injuries to the Chrome with guys like Wolf, and Bernhardt went down with an injury. He was out for the second half of the game yesterday on Sunday afternoon. So yeah, they do have some injuries there, but again, it comes down to not turning the ball over. And for a team like the Chaos, you can echo that sentiment about not turning the ball over, but then add in the fact that they need to start winning faceoffs at more than a 36% rate. So now I want to jump into the power rankings to round out this episode. Number 1, obviously you got to go with the Whipsnakes here. The winning streak continues for them, dating all the way back to 2019, and the 2-time champs look really good despite being taken to overtime on Saturday against the Cannons. The offense is absolutely cooking right now, and the defense, while maybe not as good as they were in 2020, is still very, very good. Probably still one of the better defensive units you'll find here in the PLL. And Joe Nardella, at this point, is just a human cheat code at the stripe, winning, I believe it's still about 71% of his faceoffs on the year. Number 2, I've got the Archers, flip-flopping with the Redwoods here from where I had them a week ago. But number 2, the Archers, because they absolutely dismantled the Atlas in week 1 and followed it up with another impressive performance against the Chaos on Sunday afternoon. The offense comes at you from basically every angle imaginable, and the defense might be one of the best that Chris Bates has had during his time here in the PLL, and Adam Gittleman is playing out of his mind through the first 2 weeks of the season. I mentioned came in that second half against the Chaos, gave up 1 goal, and went 88% between the pipes. So absolutely killing it are the Archers here in 2021 so far. Number 3, I've got the Redwoods. I debated putting the Cannons here, but at 1 and 2, I couldn't really bring myself to do it over a 2-1 Redwoods squad, because the Redwoods, despite losing that game to the Atlas, are still a very good team. And their offense has plenty of playmakers to be a top 3 or 4 offensive unit in the league, but the defense didn't play its best on Saturday, and I think that at the same time, TD Erlin is facing off well north of 60% through his first 3 games as a pro, which should help you win more games than not. Like I said a week ago, Nat St. Laurent said after week 1, if he can face off even above 50% on a consistent basis, they're going to win more games than not. So if he can continue the pace that he's currently on, there's no reason they can't be a top 3 team in this league. So that's why I have them at number 3. But number 4, obviously, is the Cannons. Despite taking the Whipsnakes to overtime, I couldn't see through to pushing them to 3 on this list. I believe I had them at 4 or 5 a week ago, but they'll come in at number 4 this week. The Cannons offense is really well balanced, with Lyle, Q, Drenner, Rafus, and Rabel all totaling at least 6 points through their first 3 games. Defensively, Brody Merrill looks like he could play for another 10 years, honestly, and the young guys around him are playing well together as well. But their one weakness, I would say, if I had to nitpick, their one weakness right now appears to be at the stripe with Drew Simino. Can he turn it around these next couple weeks? That'll be a big thing for them moving forward, although he didn't perform particularly well against Nardella on Saturday, and they still managed to find a way to take that game into overtime after being down 8-4 at the half. So if that's their one weakness, they're doing a good job of actually covering it up. So if he's able to face off a little bit better here over the next few weeks, watch out for the Cannons to push themselves into that top 3 within the next 2 or 3 weeks, I would say. Number 5, I've got the Water Dogs. The Dogs earned a pair of wins on the weekend, but against two of the worst teams in the league currently. The offense did come alive this weekend, though, with guys like Schlosser and Ryan Brown doing a lot of the heavy lifting on that end of the field. And like I said before, in cage, Dylan Ward seems to be settling in now, and the defense is starting to come together a bit in front of him as well, helping him out a little bit in cage. But Jake Withers is quickly becoming a top-tier face-off guy in the PLL. He currently sits 5th in the league in face-off percentage. Now, 6, I have the Atlas. The Atlas make probably the biggest jump in the rankings from week 1 to week 2 by moving up from their mom's basement at number 8. The defense looked like it was actually locked in on Saturday, taking advantage of 7 turnovers between Pennell and Kavanaugh. Jack Kincannon was back to his old tricks in cage, and while Baptiste lost that battle against T.D. Erlin on the day, the offense showed that they can attack a stout defense in the woods, and Jake Caraway had his PLL coming out party on Saturday, scoring 3 goals there. I believe he had 4 points overall. And the team just showed effort, heart, and a lot of improvement execution-wise from week 1 to week 2 on both ends of the field. But what I want to see and what I want to know is how will they build on this win moving forward? That's the biggest question, because coming into week 3 in a couple weeks, they've got 2 really tough games against 2 teams that I have put in my top 4 of these power rankings in the Whip Snakes and the Cannons. So that'll be a really tough test to see how much this team has evolved between weeks 1 and week 3. Number 7, I have the Chrome. While the Chrome and the Chaos are not very good at the moment, the Chrome has one thing going for them that the Chaos doesn't, and that's at the face-off. They have the ability to at least win some face-offs with Connor Farrell. And while the offense is struggling in life after Jordan Wolf, guys like Jackson Morrill have definitely stepped up for this offense, and I think you'll see that being the case moving forward. The question for them is, how can they get guys like Gutterding and Heacock going to help some of those younger guys out offensively so that they don't have to do that heavy lifting like how I talked about with the, I believe it was the Redwoods earlier on in this segment. And then number 8, I have the Chaos, because the Chaos played hard and fought really hard against the Water Dogs on Friday, but they dug themselves too big a hole to be able to climb out of late in that game. On Sunday, the offense went almost entire quarters without scoring at times, including scoring just the 1 goal in that second half against Adam Gittleman. And the offense just doesn't look locked in the early going of the season, turning it over 19 times per game on average. And they have almost no ability, like I said, to win faceoffs, just winning around 36% on the year so far. And Blaze Reardon needs help, and he needs help fast. So that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. We covered a ton, recapping week 2 in the PLL, sort of touching on a little bit of a preview going into week 3 here in a couple weeks. We also got into that new segment, the 2-man game, with our 2 winners and 2 losers of the weekend down in Atlanta. I got to your thoughts as well. Always enjoy getting your thoughts into the mix each and every episode, and the week 2 PLL power rankings. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.